Hello everyone, and welcome to Ready for Print. Now, this is the first video in this series, so I'm going to kind of outline, roughly, what these videos will be about, and then I'm going to talk about what this particular video is about. Ready for Print is a series that I decided on when I kept seeing the same behavior over and over again. And when I say I see the same behavior over and over again, what I mean is designers not remembering things like margins and bleed, and stressing the environment I work in a little bit, and stressing them in the end as well. And the sad part is it's completely avoidable. But I thought to myself, if I'm just learning this, then there could be a lot of people who don't know it, or people who are just learning it too, or I'm completely the slowest learner on the planet, and people have known this for a long time. So it's things like how to make sure you have the best quality document available, things like bleed, which we'll talk about in this video, crop marks, margins, all these things that are really super important for whatever you're designing. Now, you want to make sure that whatever you design is good. Well, it's obviously going to be because you made it, but you want to make sure that your printer, regardless of how they feel about the subject matter, is happy to print it and is not stressful for them. Because there are a lot of relationships that are important as a designer, and having a good relationship with your printer is definitely one of them. Now, that's what this series will be. That's a long intro for this series, but it will be the little things that I realize that are really important, that I personally need to remember as well. So I'm going to share this with you. This first one is having bleed. Now, this will apply both to graphic designers who design stuff for print and for brochures and for business cards and for whatever, and those that make things like digital art and they go to conventions. Because when you go to conventions, you want your stuff to get printed, so the best way to do that is also to make sure there's enough room for bleed. Now, this is Adobe InDesign, and that's what I'll be using for this video particularly. But there are other programs like Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator that also use bleed, but they use them in different ways. For the most part, I will be covering InDesign because it's, I wouldn't say the cream of the cream when it comes to the cream of the crop, when it comes to using design programs. This is, you've made everything and you're putting it together program. And this normally falls in exactly where you need your bleed, because when you export from here, it'll likely go to the printer. So this is where I'm covering the bulk of this session. When you make a new document in, let's try this again. I'm going to put this back to 0. When you're making a new document in InDesign, this will pop up by default. You'll have half-inch margins, which if you want half-inch margins, that's totally cool. I normally use a 1/4 of an inch margin. You won't have any bleed, actually this will be closed, and it'll be a default letter size. It'll also be facing pages. That's entirely up to you whether that's clicked or not. That's totally your game. You can have orientation one way or another, but what it comes down to is this little section down here, this bleed and slug. I don't ever use the slug part of this, but I do definitely use the bleed part of this. Now, most common bleed is 1/8 of an inch, because it gives you enough room graphically to have an overage, and then it's not a huge amount. So if your image, you just have enough on the edge for that, that's perfectly fine. About 1/4 of an inch is what, 1/8 of an inch is what is custom, and that's 0.125. That's it. And when you click across, it'll give it all the way around, because it's linked. Those little things unclicked, your margins will be different, but once it's clicked, it changes them all together. And so this is what your document will look like fresh out of the boat. But look like. Now, this is a finished product, or it was a finished product. And you can see that I have my little red marker up here in this corner, as you can see. If I scroll over, it disappears, but this little red marker up here by my cursor, that is the edge of my bleed. Now, where your bleed technically starts is the edge of your document. That big square black line. That space between the end of your document and the bleed line will be essentially your gutter for bleed. It will make sure when you send this to the printer that it has what it needs to be able to be printed and there's no headache. And it looks exactly like you designed it. That is the most important part of bleed, is that you want to have bleed because you want to make sure whatever you're designing looks exactly like you designed it when you print it. Now, of course, there'll be some color variance because you're looking at a screen versus printed product, but your design itself will remain the same. Some printers will actually change your design a little bit, and I don't mean like cut it apart and change it, but I mean when they import it in, or they look at your PDF and it doesn't have room for bleed, say if your object is really close at the edge, your printer won't be able to stretch it to create that bleed. Now, if your margins are fine, they can stretch it and make that bleed. But if you're not remembering that the bleed is there, or you're completely disregarding it and you have something on the edge, this edge, then it's likely your image may end up, you go back and make a new document and just import something in. I'm just going to import this in as an example. It's pretty huge. Let me scale it down some. Your image, I could just do this instead, silly me, will look like this. If you've designed it and you've forgotten that you need bleed and you have no bleed mark, and this is what you send, pretend there's text on it, this is what you send your printer will then look at it and go, okay, if you've got text on the edge, okay, this is not got enough room for me to bleed anything, I've got to shrink it. So what your printer will do is he'll make it have a white border around the edge. Now, this may not be an issue for you. You may think, okay, if it's a white border, that's fine. I don't mind. But some people actually, especially customers, if they see something, they expect that to be the same thing. So you want to make sure your item has bleed. If you gave this particular object, pretend that it has text, bleed, there wouldn't be an issue of having this white border. Like I did here, I made sure that the bleed was there. Now, bleed and margins go hand in hand. You have to make sure you have enough space marginally to create your document. But this video is all about bleed, and bleed, like I said, is important. Now, with Adobe Illustrator, they actually have a setting much like InDesign has here, where it allows you to make the bleed. But the downside is Photoshop doesn't. Since Photoshop is more raster based, in Photoshop's head, I guess in its programming, it doesn't think that you need bleed, so it doesn't give you an option to make bleed. But it will always be your height and your width plus 0.25. Because if you want an eighth of an inch bleed around the entire document, you're going to need a 1/4 of an inch added to each measurement. Now you're probably thinking, but a 1/4 of an inch isn't an eighth of an inch. Well, 2/8 of an inch make a 1/4 of an inch, so that will give you what you need. You may have to pull out your rulers and adjust so you know how much you have, but design with that in mind. If you're doing something in Photoshop and you know it's got to have bleed, make sure you add a 1/4 of an inch on, because then you'll get your 1/8 of an inch border for your bleed. And once you have that document, whatever you desired for your document, move that back into place. Then once you're looking at it and you know you've got your bleed, and you know you got your margins, and you know you got everything, you want to send it to the printer. Well, first you have the printer. But even before that, you have to make sure you export it the right way. Now you can export as a PNG or a JPEG or however you want to do it, but the best way to keep your quality is to export as an Adobe PDF. Now this will be test, and though there's already one that I have from earlier, but you want to make sure it's a print PDF, not an interactive PDF. You'll also save it, Yes, I know it exists. And you'll get this dialog box. It is a lot of bells and whistles. It'll probably look very confusing. But don't fret. It's perfectly fine. It's just all the different options you have for making a PDF. But the only ones you really want to pay attention to are making sure it's a high quality print. So that sets it so it's the highest quality it can have when it goes to the printer. So exactly as you designed it, it won't downsample anything, and it won't change anything quality-wise. And then this marks and bleeds. Now, by default, it doesn't have any of these things going on. You want to set just crop marks. For most printers, you don't have to worry about things like bleed, registration marks, color bars, and page info. You do want to worry about crop marks. Even if something doesn't have a bleed, you want them to know where it ends when it exports. And you also want to make sure you use document bleed settings. You've gone through all this trouble to make sure that you have enough room for bleed. You want to make sure that document has that. And if you click it, you'll notice right here that my values are inputted, that they're there to see. And then I'll export it. And when it comes up, that was good timing, you'll notice these little items here in the corner. Now, this is essentially what you want to see. This shows, okay, this is where you're going to cut it. This will be the cut line when it goes to the printer. And this is showing that you have bleed. And so your image will be exactly as you designed it. So it can go all the way to the edge, and there's no white mark like we talked about earlier. And there's no possibility of something shifting during printing and not being like all the rest you're getting printed. And something isn't cut right, so you have a little white mark. While your printer may do their best to get rid of that white mark, you want to help them do so. And by doing that, you have to make sure your stuff has bleeds. Now, this is just for print. Web doesn't need bleeds, but print work definitely does. And you could simply, right now, I could send this to the printer, and the printer would be able to print it. Now, from here on out, it's not in your control how stuff prints until you get a proof if your printer does that. And it's all you can do, at this moment anyway, bleed-wise, to make sure everything goes smoothly. You want to have the ample space so you can see your design as you imagined it and as you designed it. So bleed is key, and exporting as a PDF is also key, but we'll get to that later. PDF is the best way to export, especially if you have a bleed. I mean, you can export as a PDF, a PNG or a JPEG, even a TIFF in some cases, and you'll still have that if you select that little document settings. But it will start to downsample it. With a PDF, it just makes it easier to send, to receive, because some files can get pretty big. PDF helps you keep the quality and the size low, so that way when it gets to the printer, it is exactly what you want it to be. Now, I don't know if this has helped you, but I would hope so if you're watching it. And please remember, bleed is so important. Bleed makes sure you sleep better, that's less headache for you, and in the end, it may even cost you money, because that's the catalyst. That's the thing nobody realizes, is that if you don't have bleed in your document and your designer or your printer has to go in and fix it, that may cost you money. So this is money-saving information. Make sure to include bleed. If you forget margins, that physically make my skin crawl, but if you forget margins, that's okay. That can be fixed for sure. But bleed is one of the things that's a little bit harder to fix than margins. So make sure to include bleed. It'll save you a lot of stress and maybe even some money. So thank you for watching, and like I said, I hope this was helpful for you. If it wasn't, that's okay too. But I do hope it was. I'm just sharing on the knowledge, and hopefully it'll make you a better designer. Oh, that would be really cool. Always growing. Growing's cool. So thanks everybody for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day, and I will see you next time. Also remember to give this video a little like down there, nice thumbs up, and we'll all be happy.